Hi, this is Professor Favors with American Literature, William Dean Howells, Editha. So, Editha is a short story, and it focuses on the naivete of the main character, Editha, and how she is preoccupied with the ideal. The ideal is the romanticism, the fantastical, heroic, uh, type of strategy that oftentimes literary writers will use to convey a message within a literary work. The realism, which is the first presentation you may need to go and watch first, focuses on the ordinary person, the actual, what is actually going on, and is less about the ideal. So take some time to listen to this video lecture. It includes references to a specific historical event. And then we're going to also apply literary terms as well as look at individual content from the main source, Editha. So this is American Literature, William Dean Howells, Editha. This presentation is subject to fair use. And let's look at William Dean Howells' biography. So he was born 1837, died 1920. He died at a particular time when women were given a right um, to vote, 1920, the 19th Amendment. William Dean Howells was born in Martinsville, Ohio in 1837. Howells' father was a newspaper editor, and Howells learned the skills of a writer and editor under his father's guidance. Howells continued to work in publishing until he secured a position with the Atlantic Monthly in Massachusetts in 1866, where he served as assistant editor. 1871, Howells was promoted to editor of the magazine, and he continued working in that position until 1881. Howells lived a long, productive life, dying in 1920 at the age of 83. Howells, along with Mark Twain and Henry James, became one of the main advocates and theorists of American literary realism, a style of writing that reacted against the previous Romantic era's perceived literary excesses. Instead, the realists praised the American novel that presented characters, setting, and action as true to life. With Mark Twain and Henry James, Howells wrote and spoke prolifically about realism and its superiority over the earlier Romantic style practiced by authors such as James Fenimore Cooper. In Criticism and Fiction, Howells set forth his views on realism, arguing that fiction should be lifelike and true to human experience. Howells, along with Twain in particular, rejected the idealistic, the fantastic, the heroic, and the exaggerated, preferring instead simplicity and honesty in fiction writing. Although there were some elements of reality that Howells preferred authors avoid, particularly the salacious and the sensational, Howells consistently privileged realism over idealism in his theory of writing fiction. All right, so let's look at the historical implications. I will always add this as a slide. So we're going to recap particular historical implications. So this is still from 1819 to 1920, 19th, 20th century. So remember the Panic of 1819, um, that financial crisis, Thomas Jefferson founding the University of Virginia. Then we have two territories becoming states, and then Florida becoming a U.S. territory. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams dying on the same day, Andrew Jackson becoming president. Then we have slavery debates, Nat Turner's revolt, Oberlin College becoming enrolling female students, We have two territories becoming states, Florida and Texas. So Florida became a U.S. Territory in 1820, but didn't become a state until 1845. Then we have the Mexican-American War. We have Dred Scott v. Sanford legal decisions on blacks who were descended from slaves, were not considered American citizens and could not sue. The Emancipation Proclamation, the Reconstruction era, assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Then we have different amendments. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment grants citizenship and equal protection under the law. 15th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. It doesn't necessarily suggest that it it what it suggests is that it there was no racial discrimination in voting. Women could not vote at this time, however. So then the industrial revolutions began, leading to economic growth, technological improvement, transitioning towards manufacturing, and then the invention of machine tools. So our new date here, our new historical implication here is 1898, which is your Spanish American War, which ended Spain's colonial empire in the Western Hemisphere, securing the United States as a Pacific power. So don't forget that, because when you read Editha, you are reading the historical implications of the Spanish American War within that work. And then, of course, 1920, 19th Amendment, women's right to vote. So they didn't get, even though no racial discrimination in voting for the 15th Amendment, which suggests that black men got the right to vote before white women, women did not get the right to vote until 1920. All right, so let's look at the historical context for Editha, the Spanish American War, 1898. So, Cuban revolutionaries wanted independence from Spanish colonial rule. The conflict, which lasted between 1895 and 1898, caught the attention of America because of the economic and political instability produced within the region, given Cuba's proximity to the U.S. This stirred American public outrage over Spain's brutal attacks against Cuba, garnering sympathy for the Cuban revolutionaries. The U.S. battleship Maine exploded and sank in the Havana harbor under mysterious circumstances on February 15, 1898, motivating the U.S. to intervene on Cuba's behalf against Spanish attacks. So on April 11, 1898, President William McKinley requested authorization from Congress to do the following: put an end to the fighting in Cuba between the rebels and the Spanish forces, establish a stable government, maintain order, ensure the peace and tranquility and security of Cuban and U.S. citizens on the island. So now we understand what the motivating factor is for U.S. intervention, because there are U.S. citizens on the island. These goals led to Congress passing a joint resolution on April 20th to do the following: acknowledge Cuban independence. So it's almost like the U.S. America is paying it forward, right? Uh, uh, the mother country, or Britain, acknowledged the U.S. independence. So now we see that the U.S. acknowledging or wanting to acknowledge Cuban independence. Demand the Spanish government give up control of the island, forswear any intention on the part of the U.S. to annex Cuba, and then authorize McKinley to use military measures to guarantee Cuba's independence. So if we're going to make sure that we have a particular island that is independent, we need to do all that we can to create the policies and laws and structure to ensure that it is sustained. So the Spanish government initially rejected the ultimatum, severing diplomatic relations with the U.S. McKinley responded with a naval blockade of Cuba on April 22nd, issuing a call for 125,000 military volunteers. Spain declared war on the U.S., which forced Congress to vote to go to war on April 25th. The U.S. Navy defeated the Spanish army garrisons in Cuba and destroyed the Spanish Caribbean squadron on July 3rd. July 26th, the Spanish government encouraged the French ambassador Jules Cambon to approach the McKinley administration to discuss peace terms. A ceasefire was signed on August 12th, ending the war 4 months later. Both the Spanish government and the U.S. signed the Treaty of Paris on December 10th, 1898. All right, so as a result, Cuba received independence. Spain ceded control of Guam and Puerto Rico to the U.S. Spain sold the Philippines to the United States for 20 million. The U.S. Senate ratified the treaty on February 6, 1899. Hawaiian planters and businessmen sought annexation, but President Grover Cleveland rejected the request. On appeal to consider Hawaii as vital to the U.S. economy, serve as a strategic base to protect U.S. interests in Asia, and to prevent other nations from taking over the islands, Hawaii instead became a U.S. territory on August 12, 1898. Now, here's your key point. These events represent the historical context for Editha. They also, of course, are going to represent the historical context for the other works that are under this particular realism literary strategy, and then in our course, the module. So these events represent the historical context for Editha. All right, so to understand Editha, you have to understand the main character's preoccupation with the ideal. So that's our goal, is to look at the theme of ideal. That's the theme of the work. So now we're going to look at specific passages. There are multiple passages I want to call attention to. You may want to take out your reading so that you give a closer read to it, and you definitely may want to read it before you hear this presentation. All right, so Editha's decision. This begins the short story. The air was thick with the war feeling, like the electricity of a storm, which had not yet burst. Editha sat looking out into the hot spring afternoon, with her lips parted and panting with the intensity of the question whether she could let him go. She had decided that she could not let him stay when she saw him at the end of the still leafless avenue, making slowly up towards the house with his head down and his figure relaxed. She ran impatiently out on the veranda to the edge of the steps and imperatively demanded greater haste of him with her will before she called him aloud to him. George. He had quickened his pace in mystical response to her mystical urgence before he could have heard her. Now he looked up and answered, "Well, it's war," he said, and he pulled her up to him and kissed her. She kissed him back intensely but irrelevantly as to their passion, and uttered from deep in her throat, "How glorious!" So we see here that Editha has made a decision not to talk George out of anything, not to talk him out of the idea of going to war. She thinks it's glorious, he thinks it's just war. So when you see her not deciding to let him go, it's almost like her having power over his decision making. It is clear that if you read the rest of the work, it is clear that he does not want to go to war, or he does not favor war. But that doesn't matter to her. It doesn't matter that his head is down, his figure relaxed, um, his response to her. His response does not his response and her response are two different types of perspectives. It's war, but it's glorious for her. So war, even though she does not have to go to war, women did not have to go to war during this time. Men went to war. Women didn't join the military, of course. Men did. And so when war happens, Spanish American War happens, he is inclined to go, and she is inclined not to stop him. Editha's core value, so it's war, he repeated, without consenting to her sense of it. And she did not know just what to think at first. She never knew what to think of him. That made his mystery, his charm. All through their courtship, which was contemporaneous with the growth of the war feeling, she had been puzzled by his want of seriousness about it. He seemed to despise it even more than he abhorred it. She could have understood his abhorring any sort of bloodshed. That would have been a survival of his old life when he thought he would be a minister and before he changed and took up the law. But making light of a cause so high and noble seemed to show a want of earnestness at the core of his being. So now we have sort of like a shift from George speaking to the narrator speaking, but the narrator is speaking through the lens of Editha and her belief about George. There's a mystery about George. They did have a courtship, and it was contemporaneous uh, with the growth of the war feeling. So there are levels to this, right? In terms of the announcement of war or the hint of war, right? And the development of the decision to go to war, and then you take in the democratic views about war. Some people want to go to war, some people do not want to go to war, and then the decision to go to war, and then everything that comes after that. Well, that's kind of like a courtship. The U.S. is courting the idea of going to war right before they go to war, and they are sort of pulled into the war because of the Spanish's decision to ignore the ultimatum from the U.S. So with this contemporaneous with the growth of the war feeling is this idea. It is this processing of the decision, the hint of it, the initial, the processing of considering it, going back and forth, and policies and anything that's related to the decision, and then the actual decision. That's why she says she's not going to let him basically change his mind. Also, at the end of this, she feels that he's making light of a cause so high and noble, and it doesn't make any sense. For her, it's high and noble. For him, he is. Let's do this for a minute. For her, it's a high and noble decision. Okay. For him, he despises it. He abhors it. He doesn't think it is worth the decision, right? And so that means that if she is pursuing this idea of war, it is, and he doesn't like war, is contrary to their courtship. She's courting the idea of war. He doesn't want to court the idea of war. Okay, so keep that in mind. Editha's core value, she believes that it's a high and noble endeavor. Rather, he believes or he despises it. All right, Editha's guard. So all the while in her duplex emotioning, she was aware that now at the very beginning she must put a guard upon herself against urging him by any word or act, to take the part that her whole soul willed him to take for the completion of her ideal of him. He was very neatly perfect as he was, and he must be allowed to perfect himself. But he was peculiar, and he might very well be a reason out of his peculiarity. Before her reasoning went her emotioning, her nature pulling upon his nature, her womanhood upon his manhood, without her knowing the means she was using to the end she was willing. She had always supposed that the man who won her would have done something to win her. She did not know what, but something. George Gerson had simply asked her for her love on the way home from a concert, and she gave her love to him without, as it were, thinking. But now it flashed upon her, if he could do something worthy to have won uh, be a hero, her hero, it would be even better than if he had done it before asking her. It would be grander. Besides, she had believed in the war from the beginning. Come, pay attention to that, because no matter what, as much as people like to um, tell you that if you just do more and more and more for me, that it's going to change my mind. This right here tells you that she had already believed what she believed. So it doesn't necessarily mean so. Talking about whether or not if his efforts would make him a hero for her, right, or be grander, it doesn't matter. She had already believed in the war from the beginning. Then her ideal of him, the completion of her ideal of him, which would allow him to perfect himself, which is perfect himself based upon her ideal. But if he thought too long, which means peculiar, like in this particular context, if he thought too long about it, he might reason himself out of it. He might change his mind. So before her reasoning with her emotioning, and she would pull his nature, pull upon his nature, and her womanhood upon his manhood, meaning that there's a distinction between the woman being a person that you need to protect and save and go to war for, and a man who his manhood, that's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to be the hero of the world, right? The hero of the war. And going to war, signing up for war, is what you do as a man. And so then she wishes he had won her by. She had always supposed that the man who won her would have done something to win her. So I guess in him asking for her love, that wasn't enough. She wanted someone to win her, right? And so in his way of choosing to go to the war based upon her influence, that's a way that he could win her. At the same time, she had already believed in the war from the beginning. So it would have been really a waste of time to try to impress her. Editha's belief. But don't you see, dearest, she said, that it wouldn't have come to this if it hadn't been in the order of providence. And I call any war glorious, that is, for the liberation of people who have been struggling for years against the cruelest oppression. Don't you think so too? I suppose so, he returned languidly. But war, is it glorious to break the peace of the world? So in this one sentence, or in this one question, we already have the distinction. She thinks it's glorious. He thinks it's breaking the peace of the world, right? And when she's asking him, "Don't you think it's so that going to war is a good thing?" And he's like, "Well, I suppose so." Don't you think so? Sure, I suppose so. But then she's clarifying, or she's qualifying the decision to go to war as the order of providence. Order of providence related to a divine goal of of the U.S. to go to war. That's her belief. That is not only glorious, but is also an order of providence. Narrator's perception of Editha, that ignoble peace, it was no peace at all with that crime and shame at our very gates. She was conscious of parroting the current phrases of the newspapers, but it was no time to pick and choose her words. She must sacrifice anything to the high ideal she had for him. And after a good deal of rapid argument, she ended with a climax. But now it doesn't matter about the how or why. Since the war has come, all that is gone. There are no two sides anymore. There is nothing now but our country. So this idea of parroting, this is the narrator sort of criticizing Editha's ideal, that her ideal about the war isn't really truly hers. It's something that she read, it's something that she heard, and now she's deciding to go along with that idea. She does possess some unique aspect of her thinking on this, calling it an order of providence, right? calling it glorious, but you may have to challenge her views if she's parroting. So, did she hear from someone else that it is glorious? Did she hear from someone else that it is order of providence? Then she says she must sacrifice anything to the high ideal she had for him. After a good deal of rapid argument, she ended with this climax. But now it doesn't matter about the higher why, since the war has come, all that is gone. There are no two sides anymore. There's nothing now but our country. So she's focusing on the country aspect, the country aspect of going to war, so that the decision, the ultimate decision to go to war, is a country decision, and we all need to come together. We don't need to be off to the left or to the right on this situation. We need to all come together and be unified because this is a country situation. Now, the country situation, remember, this is the Spanish intervening with Cuban revolutionaries opposing Spain's influence, or colonizing influence. And a third party is the U.S. And the U.S. is getting involved simply because the U.S. had citizens there on the island, but also Cuba was so close to the U.S., and so they didn't want to have to do another type of American Civil War situation, right? So to sustain their own boundaries as a country, they decided to intervene. So when you look at country, okay, this is still an intervening country. U.S. is still intervening in a two-party relationship between Spain and Cuba. So how did their issue become the U.S.'s issue? But again, the narrator is suggesting that she's parroting. Epictetus' distinction: he sat with his eyes closed and his head leant back against the veranda, and he remarked with a vague smile as if musing aloud, "Our country, right or wrong?" "Yes, right or wrong," she returned fervently. "I'll go and get you some lemonade." She rose, rustling, and whisked away. When she came back with two tall glasses of clouded liquid on a tray, and the ice cluckling in them, he still sat as she had left him, and she said, as if there had been no interruption, "But there is no question of wrong in this case. I call it a sacred war, a war for liberty and humanity, if ever there was one. And I know you will see it just as I do, yet." He took half the lemonade at a gulp, and he answered as he set the glass down, "I know you always have the highest ideal. When I differ from you, I ought to doubt myself." A generous sob rose in Editha's throat for the humility of a man so very nearly perfect he was willing to put himself below her. Something to think about is she's still characterizing the war in more uh, adjectives. So, a sacred war, a war for liberty and humanity. But the people who are struggling with liberty and humanity are the Cubans, not the U.S. The U.S. is out of the American Civil War and declared independence from Britain. So where is she getting this for liberty and humanity? Well, even though this is not about the American Civil War, it still has its influence on the thinking of the people of the day. So that means they're in our current speak today, there may be trauma bonds. There may be some sort of um, post traumatic stress disorder type situation, right? They're triggered. So anytime you hear war, you're going to be triggered by war. But that sacred war, that war for liberty and humanity, that doesn't apply really to the U.S. That applies to the Cuban revolutionaries and their plot or their plight against the Spanish. But what she's doing is she's living in the ideal. The US is not actually truly in war. They are choosing to go to war with the Spanish. So this ideal, this fantastical, this need to have a hero, that's what she's living in. And then He took half the lemonade, and then I know you always have the highest idea, whether or not this is a mockery or skepticism or sarcasm. Um, uh, it leads to him doubting himself, him doubting his own beliefs about war, even though he grew up. We'll see later that he grew up with a mother who did not like war. When she speaks about the ideal of war, it makes him doubt herself. So then he's clear to being nearly perfect, perfect in his decision to go to war, and perfect in his decision to put himself below her. So she done moved from the idea of country, and we need to do this for country's sake, to him now putting himself below her, right? George's questioning, he went on again. If I believed, if I felt as you do about this war, do you wish me to feel as you do? Now, she was really not sure, so she said, George, I don't know what you mean. He seemed to muse away from her as before. There is a sort of fascination in it. I suppose that at the bottom of his heart, every man would like at times to have his courage tested to see how he would act. How can you talk in that ghastly way? It is rather morbid. Still, that's what it comes to, unless you're swept away by ambition or driven by conviction. I haven't the conviction or the ambition. And the other thing is, what it comes to with me, I ought to have been a preacher after all. Then I couldn't have asked it of myself, as I must. Now I'm a lawyer, and you believe it's a holy war, Editha. He suddenly addressed her. Oh, I know you do, but you wish me to believe so too? So now he's being a little sarcastic here, calling it a holy war. But she did say that war is an order of providence. So this question here, do you wish me to feel as you do? That's him um, questioning her ideal, her her idol, her idol of war. Her she's idolizing war in a sense, in an idealistic way. And so this question is one that creates almost a counter argument to her ideal. You want me to think like you do, essentially. Any one of us has been in a relationship where there's a power dynamic. The more that you succumb to that power dynamic, where one person is trying to have more power over you, you end up becoming what they would want you to become, or you end up thinking the same way that they would have you to think. So she, to me, she's feigning or pretending like she doesn't understand what he's talking about. But you could also make the case that Editha is so preoccupied with her ideal view of war that she doesn't that she kind of lacks some form of self-awareness. She don't see the situation as it really should be. That war is real. It's not here. It's not heroic. It's not fantastical. It, it's not an everyday thing. It's a real thing. We're living in reality, and she's living in her ideal version of war. And so then he talks about there is a sort of fascination with it, but then he says that every man would at like times have his courage tested, meaning that um, suggesting that it's not like he's going in by some ideal of ambition or driven by conviction. He's not convicted in this way to go to war. Instead, he is involuntarily having to go through the process of having his courage tested. And so she thinks it's a ghastly way, a ghastly perspective to have about it. And in contrast, what he's suggesting is what she believes. So she believes he should be ambitious about it, to become a captain or something like that, and that he should have a conviction that we should protect our country and go to war. Okay. And then he says, this holy war. And then I know you do, but you wish me to believe so too, that I thought I should have been a preacher, but then I decided to become a lawyer. And then I couldn't have asked it of myself as I must now. I'm a lawyer, and you believe it's a holy war. So here it is. You want me to believe or feel as you do that it's a holy thing. Yes, I know you do. That's what you really want me to believe. And so it's a contrast. George's conflict, she hardly knew whether he was mocking or not, in the ironical way he always had with her plainer mind. But the only thing was to be outspoken with him. George, I wish you to believe whatever you think is true at any and every cost. If I've tried to talk you into anything, I take it all back. Oh, I know that, Editha. I know how sincere you are, and how I wish I had your undoubting spirit. I'll think it over. I like to I like to believe as you do, but I don't. Now, I don't indeed. It isn't this war alone, though this seems peculiarly wanton and needless, but it is every war so stupid. It makes me sick. Why shouldn't this thing have been settled reasonably? Because, she said very throatedly again, God meant it to be war. You think it was God? Yes, I suppose that it was, that it that is what people will say. Do you suppose it would have been war if God hadn't meant it? I don't know. Sometimes it seems as if God had put this world into men's keeping to work it as they please. Now, George, that's blasphemy. Well, I won't blaspheme. I'll try to believe in your pocket providence, he said, and then he rose to go. So George is saying, well, she's saying her plainer mind is, in my opinion, her logical mind about the issue. George is getting into a philosophical a philosophical discussion about it, and she's looking at it from a fantastical hero, not realistic mind. But plainer is misleading here because plainer would suggest a realistic mind. However, plainer just means she has made a clear decision that war is important, that is it's a order of providence, and that should not really be debated. There's no need for critical thinking of it. So, and then she says, George, I wish you to believe whatever you think is true at any and every cost. That's sort of like implying something. And we'll see much later that it's implying that they won't be together anymore. Now she doesn't look at cost in the realistic point of view. She's still looking at cost in the ideal point of view, in a sense that there are some people who would die because of war, but they died a martyr or they died a hero. And but she's not looking at the realistic, meaning that there are families who are going to lose somebody on the battlefield. So I wish you to believe whatever you think is true. If I've tried to talk you into anything, I take it all back. She's lying here. This is me saying this. That she's like, just like anybody who says, I mean, if I've done anything wrong to you, I really am sorry. I promise I won't do it ever again. They're lying. They're going to do it again. So she, because all throughout the rest of the narrative, she's still pushing, whether it's implicit or explicit. And then he makes what I believe to be a mocking view about her undoubting spirit, right? I'll think it over. I like to believe as you do, but I don't. I don't indeed. That is his argument. No matter, he's still going to go and he's still going to volunteer, but that ultimately is his counter argument. Now, he loses his counter argument because he ends up going and dying. He ends up volunteering and dying. And she wins her argument because she lives in the ideal. But then she says, God meant it to be war. You can't necessarily say or suggest that the U.S. intervention in the Cuban Spanish conflict is God meaning it to be war. You could say that for the American Civil War because that was a fight for independence. But intervention into something where the Spanish have not attacked the US and the Spanish have a right to continue colonizing Cuba, um, you can't say that that is God meant it to be war. Do you suppose it would have been war if God hadn't meant it? That's an interesting question, because what if God said no, no war at all? Would Editha still live in the ideal of war? Would she still want to have war? What if God said no, no war at all? what would she do then? And so that's blasphemy. And then I'll try to believe in your pocket providence. That goes back to like the parroting aspect of it. Because remember, you can take something out of your pocket. You put something in, it serves a purpose, like your pants pocket or your jacket pocket. But then once it no longer serves a purpose, you can take it out of your pocket, shelve it, throw it in the trash or something like that. So her pocket, so he's suggesting that she doesn't really believe in what she really believes in terms of this war, because not only at the beginning she's parroting, according to the narrator, but George is calling her belief basically a pocket experience. Mother's perception of Editha, her mother. So he went away without kissing her, and she felt it a suspension of their engagement. It all interested her intensely. She was undergoing a tremendous experience, and she was being equal to it. While she stood looking after him, her mother came out through one of the long windows onto the veranda with a cat-like softness and vagueness. Why didn't he stay to dinner? Because war has been declared, Editha pronounced without turning. Her mother said, "Oh my," and then said nothing more until she had sat down in one of the large shaker chairs and rocked herself for some time. Then she closed whatever tacit passage of thought there had been in her mind with the spoken words, "Well, I hope he won't go." "And I hope he will," the girl said, and confronted her mother with a stormy exaltation that would have frightened any creature less unimpressionable than a cat. Her mother rocked herself again for an interval of cogitation. What she arrived at in speech was, "Well, I guess you've done a wicked thing, Editha Balcom." So here it is, another contrast. "Well, I hope he won't go." This is a mother with years um, on her back. Her mother definitely experienced the American Civil War. Editha might have as well. And then she says, "And I hope he will." So even though she acts like, "Well, I'm not gonna, do whatever you want to do. If I've tried to convince you to do something, I won't do it again." Here it is, she's lying. Here's confirmation right here that she's lying. "I hope he will." And then her mother calls what Editha believes a wicked thing. It's a wicked thing. So that means that the mother does not believe in the need for war. She's not on the same she's not in the same understanding that Editha believes that she is. Editha assumes that just because she believes that the country should go to war, that everybody should believe it. Just remember when she said something about it's not about right or wrong. That is, we all need to come together under one country. And so Editha believes that it doesn't matter whether or not you have a view on it, Mother or George. All that matters is that he needs to go. But her mother calls it a wicked thing. Editha's decision, voluntary. So in her room, she put together all her letters and gifts from George Gerson, down to the withered petals of the first flower he had offered with that timidity of his, veiled in that irony of his. In the heart of the packet, she enshrined her engagement ring, which she had restored to the pretty box he had brought it her in. Then she sat down, if not calmly, yet strongly, and wrote, "George, I understand when you left me. I understood when you left me, but I think we had better emphasize your meaning, that if we cannot be one in everything, we had better be one in nothing. So I'm sending these things for your keeping till you have made up your mind. I shall always love you, and therefore I shall never marry anyone else. But the man I marry must love his country first of all, and be able to say to me, I could not love thee, dear, so much loved I not honor more. There is no honor above America with me. In this great hour there is no other honor. Your heart will make my words clear to you. I had never expected to say so much, but it has come upon me that I must say the utmost. Editha. So for her, if um, If we cannot be one in everything, we had better be one in nothing. So if he decides that he's not going to do it, that is terms for termination of the relationship, because we're no longer in the courtship phase anymore. So that's termination of the relationship. And of course, she says, I will always love you. That's an emotional appeal, and I should never marry someone. But but always cancels out everything that you just said prior to it. If you're not going to marry anybody, why are you saying that the person I marry has to love his country, first of all? She's assuming that just because George doesn't want to go to war, that he doesn't love his country. He could love his country and still not want to go to war, because it disturbs the peace of things. Here it is, we just got out of the American Civil War, and now we're going to go back into another war, and that was 1865. But 1898 is still very, it still has some kind of close proximity. And then she says, there is no honor above America with me. So I think with Editha, Editha is the type of person, she'll hide behind the America buffer, but she really believes that you have to have honor towards her. That I could not love thee, dear, so much loved I not honor more. So she's just the kind of person that if you don't do what she wants you to do, uh, then it's basically over. She looks at it as a form of disagreement, but not a form of disagreement to maybe think about, let's talk about it a little bit more. Same thing about with the Spanish. The Spanish decided not to respect the U.S. ultimatum. And then decided to go to war. There was no more talking. They didn't give it any chance to try to let's see if we can talk about this or whatever. And so the U.S. was then forced to go in and intervene on behalf of Cuba. George's decision involuntary. She ran down to meet her lover and clung to him. He was very gay, and he put his arm around her with a boisterous laugh. Well, you must call me Captain now, or Cap, if you prefer. That's what the bars call me. Yes, we have had a meeting. We've had a meeting at the town hall, and everybody has volunteered, and they selected me for captain, and I'm going to the war, the big war, the glorious war, the holy war, ordained by the pocket providence, and that blesses butchery. Come along, let's tell the whole family about it. Call them from their downy beds, father, mother, Aunt Hitty, and all the folks. So now, in some ways, he is mocking. The interesting thing is both everybody has volunteered. That gives some distance to the decision, that makes some kind of an involuntary situation, and they selected me for captain. Now, somewhere down the line, down the narrative, he does talk about how he chose to be it, but in this language here, it's involuntary. Everybody and they selected me for captain gives some distance, because it's in third person plural, uh, indefinite, and he's not using first person I to commit to the action. He's not saying I volunteered or I selected myself for captain, but he does say that I'm going to the war, the big war, the glorious war, the holy war, ordained by the pocket providence that um, blesses butchery. Now he's mocking. He's mocking because the pocket providence and the glorious war, those are terms, a holy war, those are terms that um, Editha used. Now, whereas Editha was parroting the news about the war, he's now parroting Editha. And he's adding his viewpoint about it, that it's war, it's wars that bless butchery. So these are your two types of parroting that's going on. George's mockery. It's astonishing, he said, how well the worse reason looks when you try to make it appear the better. Why, I believe I was the first convert to the war in that crowd tonight. I never thought I should like to kill a man, but now I shouldn't care, and the smokeless powder lets you see the man drop that you killed. It's all for the country. What a thing it is to have a country that can't be wrong, but if it is right anyway. So yeah, he's mocking here, and now he's bringing in the realistic view. Editha has been living in the romantic view of war, the ideal view of war. This is now ushering in, these ideals are now ushering in through George's mockery, the realistic view of war. That we're not just going to war just to march on a battlefield in our uniforms and hold up guns and pretend like it's a skit. No, this is real. I never thought I should like to kill a man, but now I shouldn't care, meaning that he has no room to care about it. Because once you're in, you're in. And once that smokeless powder lets you see the man drop that you killed. So um, I don't have time to care. I'm already volunteered. They've already made me captain, and I'm now considering the visual that comes with killing a man, smokeless powder, and seeing that man drop. But it's all for the country. It's all for the country. What a thing it is to have a country that can't be wrong. So that means that the country, whether good or bad, going into war, it doesn't matter because the country, the decision of the country can't be wrong. So that's why he says, how well the worse reason looks when you try to make it appear the better. George's conversion. Gerson came again next afternoon, looking pale and rather sick, but quite himself, even to his languid irony. I guess I'd better tell you, Editha, that I consecrated myself to your God of battles last night by pouring too many libations to him down my own throat. But I'm all right now. One has to carry off the excitement somehow. Promise me, she commanded, that you'll never touch it again. What? Not let the canakin clink? Not let the soldier drink? Well, I promise. You don't belong to yourself now. You don't even belong to me. You belong to your country, and you have a sacred charge to keep yourself strong and well for your country's sake. I have been thinking all night and all day long. You look as if you have been crying a little too, he said with his queer smile. That's all past. I've been thinking and worshiping you. Don't you suppose I know all that you've been through to come to this? I've followed you every step from your old theories and opinions. She doesn't truly know what he's going through because she won't listen to him. She doesn't hear him when he says he doesn't want to go, or she doesn't, or she doesn't hear him when he says that he doesn't believe in it. But what she does is she's worshiping the ideal. He's becoming perfect in her eyes. He's moving so far into pre-hero point of view that now she's at a place where she can worship him. And so his conversion doesn't necessarily mean he still believes in war, but I've consecrated myself to your God of battles last night. So that means, in some ways, I don't believe it because I'm sitting up here drinking myself to death. But in other ways, I have no other choice to be converted on the topic, to be converted on the matter. And so you don't belong to yourself. You don't even belong to me. You belong to your country. And you have a sacred charge to keep yourself strong and well for your country's sake. So now this is sort of like trying to prop him up, to push him further into it, um, um, give him that necessary pep talk. And so that's all past. I've been thinking and worshiping you. So now, sure, I've been with you the whole time following your old theory. So now she's classifying his beliefs as old theories and opinions. They no longer matter. So whatever he believed about the situation is, it doesn't matter. That's all past. All right, George's mother's perception of war. There are two events that are going on here. George is still having a conversation uh, with Editha before he goes off to war. And then it skips to when she goes to visit his mother. He makes her promise to visit his mother um, if something should happen to him. So she winced and he laughed. You're not the bold soldier girl of yesterday. Then he sobered. If anything happens, I want you to help my mother out. She won't like my doing this thing. She brought me up to think war a fool thing as well as bad as well as a bad thing. My father was in the Civil War, all through it, lost his arm in it. She thrilled with the sense of the arm around her. What if that should be lost? He laughed as if divining her. Oh, it doesn't run in the family as far as I know. Then he added gravely, he came home with misgivings about war and they grew on him. I guess he and mother agreed between them that I was to be brought up in his final mind about it. But that was before my time. I only knew him from my mother's report of him and his opinions. I don't know whether they were hers first, but they were hers last. This will be a blow to her. I shall have to write and tell her. But if anything should happen, you might go to her and see what you could do for her. It's rather far off. She can't leave her chair. Oh, I'll go if it's the ends of the earth, but nothing will happen. Nothing can. Um, so we still don't get the mother. We get the mother's perception of war, um, based upon George's memory of her discussion of it. But we're also going to get um, the mother's direct speaking on it. All right, so um, he was raised in this idea that war is a fool thing as well as a bad thing. His father was in the Civil War. So now this text is referencing a previous Civil War, while Editha and George are enduring the current Spanish American War, 1898. And so he talks about how so he continues his realistic view of war. His father lost an arm, and then and he laughed, and then he came home with misgivings about war. The father and they grew on him. I guess he and mother agreed between them that I was to be brought up in his final mind about it. So and this was before my time. So George George struggles with two types of uh, people. Editha, who has a final mind about you're going to war, in contrast to George's mother and father having a final mind about it that it's a fool thing, it's a bad thing, that that you're not going to be brought up in the understanding of war. But again, he said this before my time, so he didn't have in both cases he didn't necessarily have a voice. And then I only knew him from my mother's reporting of him. This goes back to the parroting. So there's a parroting that Editha has when she's hearing about war, and then there's a parroting that George does of Editha's views, and now there's a parroting of what his mother has said about war. His mother and father has said about war and their opinions. I only knew him from my mother's report of him and his opinions. I don't know whether they were hers first. There you go, but they were hers last. So the parroting part of the process has taken um, it's sustained. It has taken root. But George going to war goes against that parroting. Okay. All right, there you go. So now the narrative is rejecting Editha's ideal. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Um, so George has already gone to war. There were not many letters from him, but they were such as she could have wished, as she put her whole strength into making hers, such as she imagined he could have wished, glorifying and supporting him. She wrote to his mother, glorifying him as their hero, but the brief answer she got was merely to the effect that Mrs. Gerson was not well enough to write herself, and thanking her for her letter by the hand of someone who called herself yours truly, Mrs. W.J. Andrews. Editha determined not to be hurt, but to write again, quite as if the answer had been all she expected. Before it seemed as if she could have ridden, there came news of the first skirmish. And in the list of the killed, which was telegraphed as a trifling loss on our side, was Gearson's name. There was a frantic time of trying to make out that it must be, some other Gearson. But the name and the company and the regiment and the state were too definitely given. So this ideal about rejection of Editha's idea, what causes the mother to reject her, Mrs. Gearson to reject her, and you know that she is rejecting that idea because she was not well enough to write herself and thanking her for her letter by the hand of someone else. So there's a gap. You can thank someone and then add a few more lines, but it looks like she just sent a thank you note, the equivalent of a thank you note. So that's sort of like rejecting her because if she cared about Editha being um, a companion to her George, she would have said more. What probably caused her just to send a thank you note and not a letter, even through a letter from somebody else handwriting, is the fact that she wrote to his mother glorifying him as her hero. And she glorified and supported him as well, but glorifying them as their hero. When the woman is against war, they think it's a bad thing, an evil thing, right? And so now we have confirmation that it is Gerson who has died, or George who has died. All right, let's look at the rejection of Editha's ideal in the middle part. So, the city one. So now she has visited Editha with her father. Oh, the seated woman broke in with a powerful voice, the voice that always surprised Editha from Gearson's slender frame. Let me see you. Stand round where the light can strike on your face. And Editha dumbly obeyed. So you're Editha Backham, she sighed. She sighed. Yes, Editha said, more like a culprit than a comforter. What do you come for? Mrs. Gearson asked. Editha's face quivered and her knees shook. I came because George. She could go no further. Yes, the mother said. He told me he had asked you to come if he got killed. You didn't expect that, I suppose, when you sent him. When you sent him, you didn't expect he would get killed. So now, realistic view about war has realistic representation of war is coming through the mouth of the mother. Now we get the mother's voice. This mother is confronting Editha, which works like a rejection. You didn't expect that, I suppose, when you sent him. You didn't expect him to get killed. And when you send him, you didn't expect he would get killed. So it's a opposition to the romanticism ideal of war, and this is working like almost like a wake up call, or the beginning of a wake up call for Editha. All right, so rejection of Editha's idea of the end. So, no, you didn't expect him to get killed, Mrs. Gearson repeated in a voice which was startlingly like George's again. You just expected him to kill someone else, some of those foreigners that weren't there because they had any say about it. But because they had to be there, poor wretches, conscripts, or whatever they call them, you thought it would be all right for my George, your George, to kill the sons of those miserable mothers and the husbands of those girls that you would never see the faces of. The woman lifted her powerful voice in a psalm like note. I thank my God he didn't live to do it. I thank my God they killed him first. And that he ain't living with their blood on his hands. She dropped her eyes, which she had raised with her voice, and glared at Editha. What you got that black on for? She lifted herself by her powerful arms so high that her helpless body seemed to hang limp, its full strength. Take it off, before I tear it from your back. So now we have a true rejection of Editha's idea. That in all Editha's idea about war, she didn't take into consideration that he would kill someone, some of those foreigners that weren't there because they had any say about it. Multiple people parroting this ideal about war, and George has no independent say about it. You thought It will be all right for my George, your George, to kill the sons of those miserable mothers and the husbands of those girls that you will never see the faces of. See, when you live in the ideal, you don't see the face of the pain and the face of people going through the war. You don't see the the men sitting on the battlefield having to cover their backs and make sure that their other man is not killed and make sure the gunfire doesn't hit them. They don't. She doesn't see the faces of that, and so in her anger, the the mother's anger, Mistress Gilson, she says, "Why do you have on black for? This is what you wanted. Why would you come here and have on funeral attire when this is what you actually wanted? This is something that you should have expected." So she's definitely mad because she wants to tear it off her back. All right, Editha's sustained argument for the ideal. So even though Editha is offended by the George's mother's attitude towards her, um, at the end, she still sustains her argument. And this is sort of like the narrator's point of view. A light broke upon Editha in the darkness, which she felt had been without a gleam of brightness for weeks and months. The mystery that had bewildered her was solved by the word, and from that moment she rose from groveling in shame and self pity and began to live again in the ideal. So yes, she had some depressing moments, she had some hurt moments, she had some critique from the mother, she has a critique from her own mother, maybe critique from society concerning war. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's right or wrong. All that matters is what she believes is, which is the ideal. So this is the she sustains her argument from the beginning to the end. She gets some counter statements from George, from her mother. Um, she gets a little bit of struggling with George's mother, but at the end, her rebuttal is essentially that she's going to sustain and live again in the ideal. All right, so let's look at some literary devices to have a good understanding of how to apply um, certain literary terms to a narrative, a literary work. We're not including all of them. Once you get to the end of this presentation, you'll see links, and there are many, many more, but we're just going to select the ones that most apply. So when you are reading a narrative or anytime a story, short story, make sure that you outline the narrative. So what's the plot? Plot is defined. It is what the story is about, the action that makes up the story. So in this case, Editha is about a protagonist's idealization of war in conflict with her partner's realistic view about war. It is the conflict between the ideal, the fantastical, hero based romanticism, and the realistic, actual everyday man, realism. Protagonist, main character of a story, often represents a good or heroic type. Editha is the protagonist who believes in the ideal of war. Antagonist, person or force that works against the hero of the story. George functions as an antagonist to Editha's belief. The Spanish American War could function as an antagonist to George's conception of peace. Editha's mother and George's mother also function as antagonists to Editha's belief about war. So you could have the main antagonist is the person or force that works against the hero. That's the main antagonist. But you could look at implications of antagonism in other ways. Theme, message about life or human nature, focus of the story. So the theme of Editha is support of the ideal, which is characteristic of romanticism. Realism opposes romanticism. All right, so here are more literary terms. Setting, place and the time frame in which the story takes place. So the setting is multifaceted because it includes Editha's house. However, the setting can also be considered the Spanish-American War, which is completed in 1898 and to our remembrance about 4 months. Conflict, problem or struggle between two opposing forces in a story. So the main conflict is two-part. It is between Editha and George. It is between America and Spain. The literary conflict is between Romanticism and realism. So we see Editha living in the ideal of war, but then realism sneaks in and talks about losing limbs and dying on the battlefield, etc. Dialogue, conversations between characters. The dialogue between Editha and George shows two perspectives on war. Editha believes it is order of providence that war is here. George believes that war breaks the peace of the world. So that's essentially the the foundation for the narrative. All right, narrator, person or character who tells the story, filling in background information, bridging dialogue gaps. So the narrator in Editha presents both sides of Editha and George, but there seems to be a leaning on Editha's idealistic perspective of war and George's decision to give up, arguing for her perspective on war. However, the narrator also presents another view of war from both Editha's mother and George's mother. So the narrator the narrator's purpose is to present the narrative from truly the protagonist point of view, but we get different types of point of views from other characters as well, and they challenge the ideal, the theme of ideal. Climax, high point of the story. So the climax of the story is when George is converted to Editha's ideal of war, volunteering and receiving the election of captain. This doesn't mean that he fully agrees with war. This just means she has convinced him. Editha's influential thinking has worked, and it has worked against what he was raised in. Remember, his mother and father did not want him to be brought up in the support of war. So Editha's influential thinking has opposed his own upbringing. All right, so rising action, central part of the story where various problems arise after the conflict is introduced. So the rising action is Editha's mother's views on Editha pushing George into war. She labels Editha's decision as a wicked thing. That's a rising action. Falling action, action and dialogue leading the reader to the story's end. It comes after the climax. The falling action is Editha's visit to George's mother as promised. The mother scolds Editha about her decision to send him and the effects of war. George's mother represents the realistic, actual view of war, especially with experiences through her husband. Resolution, part of the story in which the problems are resolved. Action comes to a satisfying end. Editha remains resolute about her decision about war, deciding again to live in the ideal. The narrative's argument and Editha's argument is sustained. Okay, the narrative's argument is sustained. So she starts off believing in the ideal, she ends up believing in the idea, and it doesn't matter whether um, uh, different views may have some sort of influential thinking upon her. They do not influence her ideal to live. I mean, her desire to live in the ideal. All right, so that's the end of the lecture. So these are the works consulting, your main source material from William Dean Howells and Editha, the Spanish-American War, which is the Office of the Historian site, glossary of literary terms, links, as well, writing for English courses, glossary of literary terms. And you will find that these links are also, the last two links are also under the Understanding Realism lecture. All right, so William Dean Howells resources. There's the William Dean Howells Society. There's biographical information that you can find. Usually, when a particular university houses that information at their library, and then some bibliography links as well. All right, thank you very much for listening.